Somewhere along the way, you learned a very specific lesson about what it takes to be safe with people. Not that you needed to behave, not that you needed to be perfect, but that you needed to be convenient. That your feelings weren't just feelings, they were interruptions, complications, extra weight, something that made the room tense, something that changed how people looked at you. And if you learned early that your emotions made other people uncomfortable, then it makes sense that you became someone who tries to stay readable, manageable, easy to be around. You learn to scan yourself before you spoke. You learn to edit the honest version into a version that could be accepted. And maybe no one ever said it out loud. Maybe it was quieter than that. A sigh when you started crying. A joke when you got serious. A sharp, not now, when you reached for comfort. A parent who had their own chaos and needed you to be fine. A partner who went cold the moment you had a need. So you adapted. Not because you were weak, because you were paying attention. And the stakes weren't small. The stakes were connection. The stakes were belonging. The stakes were whether love stayed warm or turned into distance. That's what this is about. Not a flaw in your personality. A strategy you learned to survive emotional environments that didn't have room for your humanity. And even if you've become high-functioning because of it, this pattern still shapes how you love, how you speak, and how you disappear. If any part of you feels seen by that, stay with me. Because what you call being too sensitive might actually be something else entirely. It might be the leftover imprint of what it cost you to be acceptable. If you're the kind of person who feels like a problem the moment you have a feeling, it doesn't usually show up as dramatic emotion. It shows up as hesitation. A pause before you answer, "How are you?" Because you're doing the math in your head. What's allowed here? What's safe? What will make me seem difficult? It shows up as minimizing. You feel hurt, but you soften it. You translate it into something more reasonable. You say, "It's fine, I'm just tired," when you're actually grieving. You say, "It's not a big deal," when something in you is quietly collapsing. Sometimes it shows up as going blank. Someone asks what's wrong, and you genuinely don't know how to answer. Not because nothing is wrong, but because you've learned that naming it is dangerous. Your mind becomes a hallway with all the lights off. And there's a specific kind of contradiction that lives underneath all of this. You want closeness. You want to be held. You want someone to care without you having to prove you deserve it. But when attention turns toward you, real attention, the kind that asks you to take up space, you feel tense. Like you're about to be exposed. Like you're about to ask for something you shouldn't. It's not that you don't have feelings. It's that your feelings feel expensive. Like they come with consequences. Like they will make you harder to love. And when that belief lives in your body long enough, you start treating your own emotions the same way other people treated them. You interrupt yourself. You downplay yourself. You move on too quickly. You become the person who can listen deeply, understand everyone, carry a lot, and still feel strangely invisible. Not because you're incapable of intimacy, but because you learned that intimacy required you to be the version of yourself who doesn't need much, the version who doesn't complicate anything, the version who doesn't ask for too much time, too much care, too much emotional room. This pattern doesn't come from nowhere. People don't wake up one day and decide their feelings are an inconvenience. They learn it. And usually, they learn it in small moments that repeat. Not always through obvious cruelty. Sometimes through emotional immaturity. Sometimes through stress. Sometimes through environments where nobody had the capacity to be present. Maybe you were met with overwhelm. The minute you expressed sadness, the adult in front of you became anxious, irritated, or helpless. So you learned to stop. Not because you didn't need comfort, because you didn't want to become a burden. Maybe you were met with dismissal. You're fine. You're too sensitive. Stop making a big deal out of it. And you learned that your emotional reality was negotiable, that someone else could rewrite it. Maybe you were met with punishment or ridicule. Your tears became entertainment. Your anger became attitude. Your fear became drama, and the safest option became emotional silence. Or maybe you were met with withdrawal, the kind that hurts the most because nothing is said. The face changes, the warmth disappears, the relationship goes cold, and you learn that emotions cost you connection. That's the core conditioning, not don't feel, but don't make it hard for other people. Don't disrupt the peace. Don't bring your mess into the room. So you become easy, you become self-contained. You become grateful for whatever scraps of care are available. You learn to be low maintenance as a form of survival. And later, people might praise you for it. They might call you mature, independent, strong, calm under pressure. But you know the truth. You weren't calm. You were careful. Because somewhere early on, you absorbed this message. If you want connection to stay stable, you have to stay convenient. And here's where it helps to understand what's happening psychologically. Because the reason you react this way isn't because you're broken. It's because your nervous system learned a pattern, and it still runs it automatically. In attachment terms, we learn who we are in relationships by how people respond to us. Not just in words, but in consistency, in tone, in presence. If your emotions were met with annoyance, shutdown, or unpredictability, your system learned that emotional expression is risky. It doesn't matter if you intellectually know you should be able to talk about your feelings. Your body has a memory of what happened when you tried. That's why this can look like a trauma response, even when nothing dramatic happened. Trauma isn't only what happened, it's what happened inside you when your needs met a wall. When you don't feel safe expressing emotion, your system will often default to survival strategies like fawning or freezing. Fawning is the part of you that becomes agreeable, soothing, accommodating. Not because you're fake, but because pleasing others once protected you. It kept people close. It reduced conflict. It stabilized the room. Freezing is the part of you that goes numb, goes quiet, goes blank. It's not indifference. It's overload management. It's your system saying, if I don't move, maybe nothing gets worse. Hypervigilance often grows alongside these. You start monitoring facial expressions, tone shifts, energy changes. You learn to predict disappointment before it's spoken. You become skilled at emotional weather forecasting. And over time, your emotions stop feeling like signals you can trust. They start feeling like threats you have to regulate. That's why you may feel a surge of anxiety when you consider being honest. Not because you're dramatic, because your nervous system learned. Honesty could lead to rejection, conflict, or abandonment. So it flags authenticity as danger. And you don't even experience it as a choice. It just happens. You self-edit. You swallow the words. You smile. You move on. Not because you don't have depth, but because your body learned that depth is costly. And when people say, just communicate, they're often missing the real problem. The problem isn't that you don't know how to talk. The problem is that some part of you believes talking will cost you connection. So you do what you've always done. You protect the bond, even if it means abandoning yourself. Once you start seeing this pattern, you notice it everywhere in the small moments that other people would never understand. Someone asks, "Are you okay?" And you can feel your throat tighten. You want to say, "No," but your brain starts editing in real time. You search for a version that won't cause trouble. You end up saying, "Yeah, just a long day." Not because that's true, because it's acceptable. Or you finally gather the courage to share something real, and halfway through you start apologizing. "Sorry, I don't know why I'm saying this. Sorry, it's stupid. Sorry, I'm probably overthinking." That apology isn't politeness. It's a preemptive strike against being rejected. Sometimes you over-explain, not because you love talking, but because you're trying to build a case for why your feelings deserve to exist. You give context. You give history. You soften your words. You emphasize that you're not blaming anyone. You try to make your emotional needs sound like they came with a receipt and a return policy. And sometimes, you do the opposite. You joke. You deflect. You turn pain into something witty. Because humor makes discomfort digestible. It makes your feelings easier to swallow for them, and for you. Or you delay. You tell yourself you'll bring it up later, when you're calmer, when it's less intense, when it's not such a big deal. But later becomes never, and the emotion doesn't disappear, it just changes form. It becomes irritability. It becomes numbness. It becomes withdrawal. And here's the quiet tragedy. The more you translate your real emotion into acceptable emotion, the harder it becomes to know what you truly feel. Because you're not practicing self-honesty, you're practicing self-management. You become fluent in everyone else's internal world, but disconnected from your own. And you start carrying this invisible labor all day long, monitoring, editing, containing, performing fine. It looks like emotional maturity from the outside, but inside, it can feel like living in a room where you're always turning the volume down on yourself. Not because you don't deserve to be heard, because you learned that being heard was risky. And over time, this doesn't just create discomfort, it creates damage. Quiet damage. The kind that doesn't show up as one catastrophic moment, but as a slow erosion of self-worth and closeness. In relationships, you can become very easy to love on the surface. You don't ask for much. You adapt quickly. You rarely complain. You give people room. You understand their flaws. You offer compassion even when you're hurting. People might say you're so chill, but chill isn't always peace. Sometimes it's resignation. Sometimes it's self-silencing. And because you're so good at holding other people, people learn to lean on you. They bring you their stress, their confusion, their sadness. You become a safe place for them. But you don't let them become that for you. Or when you try, you do it in a way that's so careful and filtered that the other person doesn't even realize how much you're carrying. So you end up with this strange emotional loneliness, surrounded but not held. And inside, something else begins to grow. Resentment. Not the loud kind, the private kind, the kind you feel guilty for having. Because you know nobody forced you to be the strong one. But you also know what it felt like, earlier in life, to be anything else. So you keep giving, you keep managing, you keep being convenient. And sometimes, because emotions can't stay buried forever, you swing to the other extreme. You go numb for weeks. Then one day, something small happens. Someone interrupts you, forgets something, speaks to you with a certain tone, and you feel an overwhelming flood of emotion that doesn't match the moment. That's not you being unstable. That's delayed feeling. That's your body finally releasing what it wasn't safe to feel in real time. And there's another internal loss that hurts in a deeper way. The ache of being admired, yet unseen. When people praise you for being strong, but nobody asks what it cost you. When people say, "You always handle things so well," but you're quietly begging for someone to notice you're drowning. When your identity becomes the person who can hold everything, you start to wonder, if I stopped being this, would anyone still stay? This is the paradox at the center of it. You want deep love, but you've been trained to accept only the love that requires you to stay convenient. You want to be known, but you've practiced being readable, not real. You want someone to move toward you, but your reflex is to hide the parts that would give them something to move toward. And the reason this is so hard to break is that your coping strategy works. It works in the way survival strategies usually do. It prevents immediate harm. If you don't express disappointment, you don't risk conflict. If you don't ask for reassurance, you don't risk being told you're needy. If you don't name your needs, you don't risk finding out someone can't meet them. Convenience protects you from certain kinds of pain, but it creates another kind. Because every time you choose safe over true, you teach your nervous system a message. Connection is more important than self-respect. And the longer you live that message, the more natural self-abandonment becomes. You don't even feel like you're betraying yourself. It just feels like being mature, being realistic, being not dramatic, until one day you realize you've become very good at keeping relationships stable, but not very good at feeling alive inside them. And that's the tragedy. Your strategy both protects you and isolates you. It helps you belong, but it keeps you unknown. It keeps you connected, but it keeps you alone. And if you've lived with that for long enough, you may start to believe loneliness is just who you are, not what the pattern created. If nothing changes, this pattern rarely stays neutral. It usually becomes heavier, because the nervous system can't stay in chronic self-suppression without consequences. Emotionally, you may move through cycles, shut down, then overwhelm. You stay composed for a long time, then you crash. You lose words, you lose energy, you lose interest. You wonder why you feel empty, and then you judge yourself for it. You may live with chronic anxiety that doesn't feel like anxiety. It feels like responsibility. Always anticipating, always preparing, always trying to prevent discomfort before it happens. And grief becomes complicated here. Not just grief for things that happened. Grief for the parts of you that never got to be held in real time. The sadness you didn't get to express. The anger you weren't allowed to have. The fear you had to manage alone. That grief doesn't disappear. It waits. It shows up as fatigue, as numbness, as an inability to trust joy, because something in you expects it to be taken away. And the identity risks are subtle, but serious. When you're trained to be convenient, you start measuring your worth by how little you need. You become proud of your self-sufficiency, but underneath it is a quiet belief that needing is shameful. You lose touch with your preferences. Your boundaries get blurry. You say yes when you mean no, and then you feel angry at yourself for not being honest. You shape your life around what keeps other people comfortable, what keeps the room stable, what keeps you liked. And if this becomes permanent, the biggest cost isn't even relational. It's internal. You stop living from the inside out. You live from the outside in. You become someone who exists around other people, instead of inside your own life. And the scariest part is that it can look completely fine from the outside. You can be successful, reliable, impressive, and still feel like you're not quite here. Like you're always translating yourself for permission. Like your real self is waiting off stage, hoping one day it will be safe to come out. So here is the reframe I want to offer, without judgment, without pressure. You were not broken. You were adaptive. You didn't choose this pattern because you lacked emotional strength. You chose it because, at some point, it protected something important: connection. And that matters, because it changes how you see yourself. Instead of, "I'm too sensitive," it becomes, "I became highly trained at being easy to hold." Instead of, "I'm needy," it becomes, "I learned that needing led to consequences, so I tried to remove need from my personality." Instead of, "I don't know how to communicate," it becomes, "My body associates communication with danger." That's a completely different story, and it's a story that makes room for compassion. Because when you look closely, self-abandonment is often a form of intelligence under unsafe conditions. It's a child, or an earlier version of you, looking at the emotional environment and making a calculation. What keeps love close? What keeps the room calm? What keeps me from being punished, mocked, or ignored? You didn't fail. You solved. And maybe that solution carried you a long way. But solutions have seasons. What once protected you can later imprison you. So the goal isn't to become more emotional. The goal isn't to force vulnerability, or to turn every feeling into a conversation, or to prove something to anyone. The goal is simpler and quieter. To become less afraid of your emotional reality, to stop automatically disqualifying yourself, to become less loyal to the roles that required you to disappear. Because you are allowed to exist in your full humanity, even if other people once treated that humanity like an inconvenience. And from here, the way forward is not a dramatic personality makeover. It's a middle path, a form of honesty that is contained, grounded, and protective of you. Because you don't need to swing between silence and spilling everything. You can practice something more stable, selective truth. Contained honesty might look like naming what's real, without building a courtroom case. Instead of explaining for 10 minutes why you're upset, you might say, "Something about that didn't feel good for me." Instead of apologizing for having a need, you might say, "I need some reassurance right now." Instead of disappearing when you're overwhelmed, you might say, "I'm not okay, and I'm not ready to talk in detail, but I don't want to pretend." That's not oversharing. That's integrity. And the next part is selectivity. Not everyone has earned access to your inner world. One reason being honest feels dangerous is that you may have practiced honesty with unsafe people, people who weaponized it, minimized it, or made it about them. So a healthier alternative isn't be open with everyone. It's choose a few people who can hold reality. And it's okay if that circle is small. Boundaries live here too, not harsh walls. Clear edges. The boundary might be internal first, noticing the moment you start performing fine and pausing. Asking yourself quietly, what do I actually feel? What do I actually need? What am I afraid will happen if I tell the truth? That pause is nervous system work. That pause is self-respect. And maybe for a while, the change is not what you say out loud. It's what you stop saying inside. You stop calling yourself difficult for having a feeling. You stop treating your needs like moral failures. You stop confusing convenience with love. Because here's the truth. Your feelings were never the problem. What happened around your feelings was the problem. And you don't have to heal this in a dramatic way. You don't have to fix yourself into a new personality. You can just begin by giving your emotions the dignity of existence, by letting them be information again, instead of evidence against you. And if you need a closing line to hold on to, let it be something simple and steady. You didn't become too sensitive. You became highly trained at being easy to hold, but you were never meant to be convenient. You were meant to be real.